There are lots of lovely things on a railway, and to many they are an attractive and pleasant way to travel. But there are some things that happen that are not so nice, and the tragic story of Elizabeth Camp was one of them. The circumstances? Mysterious. The motive? Unclear. But maybe we can shed some light on this 125-year mystery. The year is 1897. Railways have long since been established as the kings of transportation for decades, and the stations of London were packed with all sorts of people travelling, either for pleasure or for work, and Waterloo station was no exception. On the platform, waiting for the 8:23 train, Edward Barry was anxious to meet his fiancée Elizabeth. Edward was described as a kind soul, but a bit of a worrier, and had hurried from his work to meet her. She was a pretty woman, and he didn't fancy her walking alone on the busy London streets at night. As the London and South Western train pulled in and the passengers alighted, Edward tried to pick her out among the throng. When the passenger swell subsided, he realised to his horror that Elizabeth was nowhere to be seen. He looked all around the station and even considered she had missed the train. He stood at the ticket barrier and had a gut feeling something was wrong. His gut assumption was sadly correct, as several shouts and a commotion near a second-class compartment caught his eye. It was a general rule that the train be cleaned when it reached its end of the line, and the 8:23 was no exception. The carriages were organised into compartments, and although corridors and gangways were becoming the norm, this carriage had none. It meant that people could only enter and leave the compartment at a station. The cleaner had opened the door to a scene of horror. A young woman had been brutally attacked. Her head and torso were under the seat, with only her legs visible. Her injuries were extensive, and it was clear she had already passed on. Edward watched as the police arrived and lifted her onto the platform. He followed behind the woman to the mortuary. Having identified who he was and how he was related to her, he was called to identify the body, and to his anguish, he confirmed the body as Elizabeth. If there was one word to describe Elizabeth, it would be busy. For someone who had a basic education, she was rather an intelligent and hard-working young woman. She worked her way up to manager in a very busy local pub and was considered to be fair but firm with the patrons. Although not upper class by any means, she made a comfortable living from her trade and had enough disposable income to take the occasional day trips in second class. Her years in the bar trade industry had not made her soft in the slightest. She was known to have a fair but stern reputation and wasn't above removing customers from the pub if they were rowdy. She was a lady that in most respects could take care of herself. Elizabeth had a rare day off to visit her younger sister in Hammersmith, to go shopping and to discuss wedding plans, and later in the day her older sister in Hounslow. After taking tea and presumably chatting about the upcoming wedding, the mood was jovial. On her way back they met with a gentleman friend, and the trio went to the local pub for a pint. Elizabeth then boarded the 7:42 to Waterloo. Although Elizabeth was irritated by her fiancé's over-worrying, she didn't mind him meeting her at the station, as the pair were due to go to a concert later that evening. The compartment was empty, and with a cheerful wave, the train departed on time. Once the shock of the discovery began to subside, the police began to search for clues. Unfortunately, the scene had been disturbed from the start, as Elizabeth's body was removed and laid on the platform. She was moved to St Thomas's Hospital, where an autopsy was conducted. It was clear she had died from a blow from a heavy object, and there were signs that she tried to defend herself, although some experts seemed to debunk this scenario later. Her undergarments were also undisturbed, and she had no signs that she had been violated. Elizabeth's pockets had been turned out, and her ticket is missing, as well as some money. Elizabeth was smart to know it didn't do well for a lone woman to parade expensive things, so the majority of her jewellery was costume, including a brooch. The brooch was still on her person, indicating the attacker either identified the brooch was costume jewellery or they simply ran out of time. The final clue was that Elizabeth was still warm when she was found, meaning time of death could be placed up to 30 minutes prior. Using simple maths, the police could also show roughly the geographical location of where she died. Attention now turned to the compartment. The compartment was an utter mess, but the police did find evidence. On the floor, a pair of bone cufflinks were found. They were nothing to do with Elizabeth and no one recognised them. And because of the splatter, the police concluded that the attacker must have significant bloodstaining and be easy to spot. The only other item in the compartment was Elizabeth's broken umbrella, but it was noted her green purse and its contents were missing. But the best clue came from the tracks. Because Elizabeth's time of death was established, police were able to focus in on one area. Sure enough, the work paid off, as hidden in the undergrowth between Putney and Wandsworth, the murder weapon was found. It was a chemist's pestle. It was covered in blood and hair that later matched to Elizabeth. The pestle was weighty, made from ironstone china, and had the number 6 or 9, dependent on which way you looked at it. It was an exciting find, as a chemist's pestle was rare. However, since pestles could be bought separately from mortars, and with no official maker's mark, the location where the pestle came from would prove a problem. All the evidence and the case file was handed over to Superintendent Robinson from the London and South Western Police Division and Chief Inspector Marshall from Scotland Yard, and straight away the call went out for witnesses. The first witnesses were the station staff. It was hoped that someone would have seen a bloodstained man rushing through the crowd, but the porter saw nothing of value. The next was the family friend that was invited to join Elizabeth at the pub in Hounslow. The man's name was called Stone. After he excused himself from the pub, he left Hounslow for an unknown business for several hours, and unusually he knew the exact train Elizabeth was going to take. But other than that, there was nothing directly linking him to the crime, so he was soon released. Inspector Marshall dove deeper into Elizabeth's close circle of friends. It transpired that Elizabeth had a side hustle and would lend money to people close to her. Loan sharking had become popular in the last decade, and it was a lucrative way to earn a fast buck. High interest rates and the manner in which the customers were persuaded to repay made a lot of enemies. However, Elizabeth was careful who she lent money to, and as every person was interviewed, they all had airtight alibis. Meanwhile, the locals were getting restless with the lack of progress, and just like social media today, rumours started to circulate. Local pubs and social gatherings became a hotbed of suspicion. One rumour circulating was that a tall man was seen in the Elephant and Castle pub in Vauxhall on the night of the murder. He was pale and shaking, but nothing linked him to the murder. Another story emerged of a man seen acting strange, having left Wandsworth Station. The man appeared excited and ordered a brandy at the pub called the Alma. The landlady called him out on his appearance, where he jumped up, hailed a cab, and was never seen again. Eventually, the Alma story passed from person to person, gaining more detail, until even those spreading it would pause considering how absurd it was. A man was actually arrested on these allegations, but was released due to lack of evidence. An inquest into the murder was opened and all avenues explored. Considering the police presence in Vauxhall and where the weapon was found, it was likely that the murderer left the train at Wandsworth. This debunked the murderer going to the Alma, as he would have needed to have gotten off at Vauxhall to make the timeline work. After much deliberation, the official verdict to the murder of Elizabeth Camp was willful murder by persons unknown. As time passed, the trail would go cold. The evidence was shelved, and the case file resigned to a dusty cabinet. It remains one of only a few railway murders unsolved. Although it's periodical to go through old cases as technology improves, given the way the evidence was collected, it is unlikely the murder will ever be solved. But what do you think? Do you think it was a person getting revenge on a bad debt? The mysterious man in the Alma? Or a chancer thief jumping a lone woman as he boarded her compartment? I'll leave this one up to you.